Pokemon is a game series that has sold over 7 copies worldwide, with at least 20 of them being to me specifically. Now, you don't reach those kinds of numbers without doing something right? But just because it's right doesn't mean it can't be more right? This video is going to be looking at the general structure of the Kanto region outside of its many specific depictions across the franchise to try and make an even righter version of what is most likely most players' first introduction to Pokemon. I will sometimes be bringing up my retyped Pokemon video. It was my statistically most popular thing, but don't worry, if it matters, I'll explain it. Let's start by breaking down Kanto into 3 sections. The end, the beginning, and something between those two, don't know what it's called. We start at Pallet Town, and we make our way through 2 gyms before we depart the SS Anne, ready to take on Sabrina. The next section is using Cut to probably fight Surge, up until we assassinate Koga and we have HM Surf. The end begins with Blaine, and the ending of your beginning adventure is when you get bored of constantly refighting the Elite Four. While all 3 make the whole game, I would never fight our boys in uniform, even if that boy is a fictional man who wears the uniform of a military that probably doesn't exist. He still made lieutenant back in Pokénom, and he deserves our respect, damn it. So we're only going to be focusing on the first block. Now let's keep splitting things into 3s. I don't have a problem, I can stop anytime I want. First, we have the player making their way to Brock. First, they must survive the gauntlet of Pidgey and Rattata. Then they enter the blood-soaked Viridian Forest. But how could they possibly get harder than all those guys, Metapod in hand? After an optional stop in the Despair Pit that is Route 22, the player must triumph over Brock the Rock Johnson. Then the player goes off to face Misty. First, they must survive the gauntlet of Zubat and Geodude. Then they cross the blood-soaked Nugget Bridge. How can they possibly get harder than all those guys, Nugget in hand? After an optional stop in the Despair Pit that is the majority of Cerulean City, the players must triumph over Misty the Rock Johnson. Our third of the first third of Pokemon is the SS Anne adventure. First, they must survive the gauntlet of the Daycare Lady and being underground. Then they enter the blood-soaked Vermilion City. How could they possibly get harder than all those guys, fishing rod in hand? After an optional stop in the Despair Pit that is Diglett Tunnel, the player must triumph over SS and Captain The Rock Johnson. Now let's talk about game design, in the form of loops. After all, they come in 3s. Primary loops are what you do in a game second to second. If you think about life, that's your breathing, you're sleeping, you're looking at memes. In Pokemon, there are 2 general primary loops. There's the overworld exploration and battling. Unfortunately, despite my many bricks thrown towards Nintendo, they have not added an endless meme stream to the game. Secondary loops are more infrequent activities. In real life, that's stuff like cooking food, exercising, and making memes. In Pokemon, both primary loops evolve into different secondary loops. Overworld exploration goes from the area you can directly see to the broader areas you explore. This is the difference between walking and going for a walk. The fighting loop becomes managing your current party and its items. Sometimes it can be hard to tell secondary and primary loops apart, but I have a very good method for that. Let's move on to tertiary loops. This is the grander, more overarching goal. In life, that's finding a significant other, getting a good place to hide them, and acting surprised around the police. Pokemon gives you filling the Pokédex and the long-term team building. This is the loop that the game industry has really changed the most over time. Like Mario has gone from rescuing the princess in World 8 to exploring every world for hidden collectibles so that you can unlock the real final level. Pokemon really nailed these loops in the first game. All three loops really do feed into each other. Scarlet and Violet did a lot of things, and I have strong opinions on those things. But in order to not cry, scream, soil myself, I'm going to just use its three main quest branches to help isolate the Pokemon gameplay loops, and better demonstrate them for you, the hypothetical audience. I hope there's an audience. The primary loop is best shown off by the evil team. Generally, the player isn't actively looking for them in Kanto. The player just happens to walk into their plans. They are then just a series of battles that are rarely hard enough to actually cause the player to have to strategize beyond the current fight, reinforced since they have a variety of Pokemon and fluctuating team sizes. This prevents a player from planning like the gyms let them. Players just put a Pokemon at the front of their party and hope it can win the next fight. Or at least the next Pokemon so that they can switch in between feints. This makes Team Rocket that mindless, go forward along the only path and just fight what pops up sort of loop. Secondary is the gym challenges. The player isn't just going in a straight line. They have to actually travel with an objective to locate and fight the clearly defined gym leaders. Players might consider the gym leaders while they fight, choosing moves carefully and fighting extra fights to get that little extra boost to their levels. The player is more conscious of their party's health in a gym too, often leaving and healing to make sure that they are ready for that next fight. It does sometimes reach that higher loop level too, but the strategy is usually nothing more than finding the effective type/type combo for this gym. Tertiary is like the Titan Pokemon, if you actually got to catch them after the fight. The player fights, hears about, or just notices a blank spot in their Pokedex, and sets out to find and capture a new Pokemon. This can be as simple as going to the adjacent route and walking around until the wild Pokemon decides you are submissive enough to fight. But it could also be finding strange bodies of water and sailing until you discover a power plant full of rare Pokemon. Sometimes it's strange money quests to buy it from a game corner, or a trip to the areas of the Safari Zone. This is then layered onto figuring out how to evolve certain Pokemon into their powerful final stages. Although Kanto Pokemon don't often have much more than either using one of the 4 stones or trading it. Pokemon really has the primary loops down, so I won't be touching that at all. This isn't a video on fixing gym leader teams or Pokemon moves. There are tons of those. I think a lot of those videos are focusing on a lot of the more easily seen flaws of the game. Gyms are, after all, where all 3 of the loops are most connected. I'm not trying to throw any shade on any creators, it's just not this video. I already somewhat changed up the tertiary loop in my retyping video, making Pokemon more varied and giving players more options to spice up their teams. You can imagine that anytime I add a new wild Pokemon into an area, it is to make this tertiary loop slightly better. In this video, I am going to be focusing on the secondary loop. The secondary loops are good enough in Kanto, but I'm just going to be adding a few things, to reward the player for deeper exploration of areas, backtracking, and talking to the NPCs. When it comes to completing the decks, there's a small wrinkle in Kanto. And that's that nobody knows how to make the Pokemon function like well-adjusted adults and call the stork. This means that, assuming this Kanto rework functions for all versions of Kanto, the design would need to have the lowest evolution of every Pokemon available to catch. This is why a bunch of single-stage Pokemon are only found at the very end of the game. Tangela doesn't evolve into anything, so it doesn't matter what level you find it. Compare that to a Weedle, who needs to be found right as the game starts, since it has a very low evolution level. This is also why you can find all the fire types with stone evolutions in Cinnabar Island. For a Vulpix, its level has no bearing on how it evolves, so it can be in the final areas of the game, at any level, no issue. This creates a very delicate tightrope. It discourages late-game exploration if every Pokemon is found super early, but it also leaves some Pokemon in places where they'll never be used. There's no easy answer to this. My thought on this matter is to offer more opportunities in the early game to receive, trade, or get gift Pokemon that can be found later in the game. Trade Pokemon in most games aren't very interesting. They mostly gave up in the modern games. But I think that the key to trade evolutions is that a Pokemon should be interesting and require a Pokemon that the player is likely to have or that they have the ability to catch fairly easily. And for gift Pokemon, they're best when it's a choice, like the fossil Pokemon or the Hitmons. The act of choosing makes a player form an attachment to that Pokemon. Shout out to the kings of all gift Pokemon, the starter Pokemon. And the legendary birds are actually an amazing way that Game Freak rewards late game exploration. There are 3 incredibly powerful Pokemon, all in optional areas, that you can power up your late game team with right before you get to the Elite Four. Now let's start looking at the actual game. First, you have to select your difficulty. For the first 3 gyms, a player has limited options on what they can catch, and that means that the starters really matter in those early difficult fights. Bulbasaur is super effective against Brock and Misty while resisting Surge. Squirtle beats Brock, struggles with Misty, and then falls over dead fighting Surge. While Charmander is not effective against Brock or Misty, but is effective at handling Surge. Since more Pokemon are getting added, that difficulty level is still there, but it's been drastically toned down. Route 1, where boys become boys that have consumed rat flesh. This dead land holds no trainers, just an endless horde of Pidgey. This route and Oak's Parcel are very important for the player. It teaches them that it's fine to backtrack to areas they've already been, and that there are sometimes shortcuts on those routes. Going on that small travel loop back to Pallet Town is an excellent way to reinforce the primary and secondary loops. The player learns about avoiding grass and selecting tackle for their primary loop. The player learns about navigation, ledges, and Pokemon centers for that secondary loop. It doesn't have anything to do with the tertiary loop, though. The early gamer TAD aren't making people excited for new team members, even when you do get the Pokedex and the Pokeballs. Its only lesson is that grass can have more than one kind of Pokemon, which I think most people would assume anyways. Now, most people hate turning or pressing more than one button, so most players will just keep going north, the path of progress from Pallet Town, and that will lead them to Route 2. Bet you thought I was going to say Viridian Forest. I'm going to make Route 2 give the player a chance to catch a Spearow. Spearow is on Route 22 normally, so it's not a big change to when it would appear, but it is a Pokemon just similar enough to Pidgey to make players connect that they are almost identical Pokemon and fill a similar niche. Even the slowest child, like myself, can make the connection that they don't need 2 birds with the same moves. If a player is catching Pokemon, this choice between using a Pidgey and using a Spearow will probably be their first team-building choice. When they enter Viridian Forest, it does something very similar but decidedly opposite. Weedle and Caterpie are both similar Pokemon, but the Weedle has Poison Sting and Caterpie has Tackle. The player experiences status effects and the concept of Pokemon who only share one type between them. Both Beedrill and Butterfree, which the player will encounter in the forest later, will reinforce this lesson even more. And, of course, these Pokemon will probably be the player's first evolutions. The next lesson taught here is the extremely rare Pikachu. If the player is just blitzing through the forest, they might only see it once, but not at all is very likely. Most players, though, on their first playthrough will get a bit lost in Viridian Forest or make frequent trips back to the Pokemon Center and will probably find a Pikachu. This teaches players that some Pokemon are rarer than others, and to be vigilant for those rare encounters. Viridian Forest is an amazing lesson in game design. The status effects, constant encounters that drain Pokemon health, and navigating the maze all wonderfully fill that secondary loop. Meanwhile, the evolutions, the rare Pikachu, and the 2 rival bug types really feed that tertiary loop. In Pokemon Let's Go, and a lot of ROM hacks, they do something in this forest that I really don't like. They add grass types to the forest. And they do this to solve an obvious problem: Brock. But it makes Viridian Forest itself a lot more busy and messy. A new player is still trying to learn what makes a Weedle into a Kakuna. They don't need the Oddish or Bellsprout lying around. And that also has a secondary problem. It makes Bulbasaur players feel worse about choosing Bulbasaur, since their starter's type is the only one that can be caught right away. Now we have reached Pewter City. What a boring place. The only other thing than Brock for a player to do here is visit the museum, and that has nothing in it of value for a player. Now once they have cut, they can actually get a fossil here, but they can't even use that fossil until the third of the game. This general lack of things to do around town is very common across the game, and it really hurts the secondary loop, disincentivizing looking around cities. To make Pewter more interesting, I want to give the museum a gift shop, and that shop will sell weak or early game TMs. Not when the player first arrives, though. They will explain what a TM is and tell the player that they'll be opening soon, though. The player will want TMs, and will now have a more pressing reason to want to come back to Pewter City once they gain the ability to backtrack later in the game. I'm also going to add in an optional fight. A black belt in training who has a high-level Kakuna and Metapod. In my retyping video, Kakuna and Metapod were both made part rock. This gives the player another chance to face even more rock types to prepare themselves for Brock. The black belt will, when defeated, say that his master told him that Weedle and Caterpie held a secret to beating Brock. What he's referring to here is that Butterfree learns the move Confusion, and Beedrill is a fighting type in my retyping. The third change to this initial visit to Pewter is that there's going to be a person blocking the door to the gym. This person wants to face Brock and knows that his Pokemon are weak to water types. And they know that there are water type Pokemon to catch on Route 22, but they can't go for one reason or another. They will offer to trade their Vulpix for a player's Poliwag. After talking to the player, they'll then move out of the way to the gym door. This lets the player know about Route 22 if the player never explored it, and lets the player know that interesting Pokemon will not always be on the direct path to your destination. Route 22, where boys who eat rats become boys who eat monkeys. This crucial route is never really signposted for new players. I was an idiot kid who played Blue, Yellow, and Leaf Green. I can confirm I never went here as a kid. This route serves two important purposes. It has a rival fight, and it holds Pokemon with the key to defeating Brock. The rival fight is out of my scope, but the Pokemon you find here aren't. This route holds the fighting type Mankey, and usually it holds the Nidos. Both of their fighting moves are strong against Brock, in theory at least. Onix has such a huge defense that Double Kick barely scratches him. Mankey also didn't know any fighting moves in the early gens, at least not in time to fight Brock. The Nidos also don't know Double Kick when they're caught, so the player just has to know that the Nidos will learn a fighting move. Ironically, despite being weak when you catch them, they then incredibly quickly scale up into a late-game destroyer of runs. I'm going to be changing the really underpowered Mankey and the incredibly overpowered Nidos. We are going to use Poliwag and Oddish or Bellsprout, whichever one. This means that Grass isn't the only type you can catch in the early game. Quick note, Oddish and Bellsprout aren't poison with my retyping. But you can take your new Poliwag to Pewter City and get the Fire-type Vulpix. Now, all three of the starter types have some representation in the early game, complete with a lesson on trading Pokemon. Why choose Poliwag, Oddish, and Vulpix? Well, they're all monotype Pokemon, now at least, who need later game stones to evolve, so they aren't going to be spiking a player's power too much, unlike Nido, Queen, and King. This lets them be part of an early team without overshadowing the starter that they would conflict with. Now let's talk about the gyms. Not the specific fights inside, but more their role in pushing the player forward. Gym leaders are the toughest trainers in the world, but they also need to be weak enough that a child can beat them with their brand new rat. The Pokemon Legends anime is one of the best things ever made, and it has a solution to this problem, with Brock stating that he's using a team for fighting people who don't have any badges yet. But there are other options to make gym leaders feel cool and powerful without feeling like they're babying you. Letting you rematch them. For this redesign, I would think that every gym leader should have 3 teams. Their initial team, a pre-Elite Four rematch team, and a post-Elite Four rematch team. For the first third of the game, I don't think rematches should be a factor yet. Let them come about once the world opens up after the SSN. But once they do unlock the rematches, the teams should also have some more thematically tied team members, like Brock having a Golbat or a Machoke, even though they're not rock type. This lets a player think that the gym leaders are actually good trainers, while leaving the initial teams as easy fights for beginners. This also factors into the tertiary loop, by letting players fight rarer or more powerful Pokemon that random trainers might not have. It also makes a player more likely to want to backtrack to experience these new, harder fights. These harder fights then need tougher teams, which then leads to more experimentation in team composition. Besides, this is a gym. People go to gyms to work out and train. I never understood why there weren't training options at gyms in the standard games. Now for something most people don't think about. The fighting dojo. Other than your rivals or the Sword and Shield League Challenge, this is one of the only groups attempting to take on the gyms. I want to have dojo members in each town that have a gym. They're out there trying to win the right to take over the gyms across Kanto, and failing horribly, because they suck. It was always strange to me that they kept going after the one gym that they definitely couldn't take. I get that that is the joke, and it is a good joke, but we can just keep that joke by having their master and headquarters facing off against Sabrina. Meanwhile, they have agents testing out the other gyms. These dojo members, with their small bits of prize money and some XP, should help stop players from getting soft-locked, which is a big problem in Gen 1. They would also, when beaten, be able to share what they know about the city's gym. Earlier I mentioned one of their members, that black belt in training in Pewter. They're there to help show that the world is alive, and that your character is not the only 10-year-old having an adventure. But you are the one doing the best at their adventure. It's really cool if the player enters a city and thinks, now where can I find that dojo member? And then searching the city for them. It's really good for the secondary loop, prompting that exploration of town, meeting the NPCs, seeing what's around. Alright, back to progress. Route 3, where boys who eat monkeys become boys who eat snakes. I did change the type of Arbok to ground poison, Sandslash to ground steel, and Wigglytuff to fighting fairy. And with all 3 of those available, the player now has plenty of team building options post-Brock. My personal favorite part of Route 3 was always the Magikarp salesman, and I want to make him a little bit better. I want to make the Magikarp cost more. I'm thinking 2,500. That way it actually hurts the player's wallet a bit. Later on, there'll be a Magikarp salesman in Vermilion, who will sell unlimited Magikarp to 500. This completes the scam that the player fell for. In the base game, $500 might be less than the Pokeballs some players would spend catching a Magikarp. So he actually had a very good deal. Mount Moon, come, step in Zubat Guano. You'll lose your blood, but you'll gain wonderful memories. Team Rocket and several new species of Pokemon are in Mount Moon, with different floors having different encounters. It also gives the player a choice between the helix and dome fossils. In the original game, Mount Moon just felt like Viridian Forest 2.0. It teaches the confusion condition with Zubat, and it creates a gauntlet to make the players use the Pokemon Center. This longer, slower dungeon needed more to actually do to make the player engage with its systems. I want to focus on the difference between the floor's encounter rates, with a reward for a player utilizing that mechanic. I couldn't think of much else. I also want the player to actually get to receive the fossil Pokemon here. Aerodactyl can still be a Cinnabar revive. Aerodactyl is a much better Pokemon after all. When the scientist at the end of the cave fights the player, he will have two Pokemon, Kabuto and Omanyte, which he claims to need for protection while he's researching in Mount Moon. There's Team Rocket everywhere, so of course he feels not safe. I think that I want this scientist to offer one of his two Pokemon if the player will help him complete his research. So I want him to be looking for a Pokedex that has registered a caught Onix. The researcher says that Brock apparently caught one in Mount Moon, but the scientist has been looking all over the floor and can't find it. If the player goes back and talks to Brock, Brock will explain that he caught his Onix on floor 2 and has never seen one on floors 1 or 3. The player, with that info in mind, can catch Onix and get the gift Pokemon from the scientist. This is fresh after the players fought Brock, so most people will think of Onix as an incredibly powerful giant snake monster. And now they'll get to use it in the part of the game where its stats aren't totally garbage. And the promise of these two incredibly rare Pokemon will drive most people to do this quest. I want this quest to have a reward that is both instant and clear to the player. Route 4. Boys who eat snakes become boys who eat Mega Kicks. Route 4 has a strange feature. It has a roadblock to prevent backtracking. And I agree with this. There isn't much in the previous areas that's worth going back to. This way, it forces the player to deal with both Misty and Bill with only the nearby resources, which are ample. The player can beat Misty with what's in the area. Backtracking and exploration are very good, but if they come without rewards, then the player will be discouraged from attempting it. A temporary stoppage to prevent having to make more events for earlier areas is effective at halting that backtrack fatigue. Even if there was more content, it would require the player to travel back through Mount Moon to get to Pewter, and those Zubats show no mercy. Cerulean City has one thing going for it. It will sell you the vehicle to get the hell out of Cerulean. Of course, the only way out of Cerulean is through some random guy's house. So, good luck with that if he's out for milk. Cerulean City itself only has two things to do. There's a trade that the player can't complete in the base game, and a hidden rare candy. Nothing else. To make the city more interesting, I'm starting by removing Nugget Bridge. Money isn't a very interesting thing to get, and it actually creates a problem. You see, with a bike shop nearby, the player might think they actually need to save up for the bike, so it disincentivizes them from purchasing anything in the stores. Now, it's going to become Bait Bridge, with the reward being an old rod. This creates a bit of a joke. Team Rocket is so stingy that their reward is a bad old fishing rod. Adding in the old rod also gives the player a new way to find and catch Pokemon. The dojo member here will have the electric fighting type Electabuzz, but he can't zap the ground type Krabby that one of Misty's grunts uses. This gives the player a lesson that second types could radically alter the dynamic of a fight. And with Surge coming up, the player can use this Krabby knowledge against Surge later, rewarding the player for thinking about the dynamics that they've been shown. Finally, there's the town trade. They're still going to offer a Jinx if you want to trade, But now the trader wants a Clefairy. Since Clefairy is found in Mount Moon, and the player can't get back in to Mount Moon, this makes the player who failed to catch Clefairy feel like they made a mistake by not catching one of every Pokemon that they saw. But also does reward that feeling to a person who did catch every Pokemon that they saw. Route 24, where boys who eat Mega Kicks become boys who eat Smiling Onions. Route 25, where boys who eat Smiling Onions become boys who eat whatever the hell an Abra is. There's not too much to talk about with these routes, other than the fact they have two distinct bodies of water to test out that new Old Rod on. Giving the player two different water-type Pokemon, one for each route, should encourage the player to fish in every body of water that they come across. Now that the player has a Rod, and possibly Poliwag, I want as many water-type Pokemon as possible to be fishing exclusives. This gives water types a more unique feeling compared to other Pokemon, since they have a unique catching method. We're skipping the Misty fight now, and heading straight to Route 5, where boys who eat whatever the hell an Abra is just give up on this joke. Route 5 has a daycare, and I want that daycare to have a trade opportunity. Specifically, I think a Chansey. Players have been seeing Chansey in every Pokemon Center, and now they can finally get one. But the daycare people want a Pokemon that the player couldn't have access to yet. I think Growlithe as a normal catchable dog will do the trick. The daycare lady just wants a pet for their precious grandchild. This will create another reason to backtrack for the player later, like the eventual TM shop in Pewter. It also helps that players will be reminded of this trade whenever they enter a Pokemon Center, so they won't forget about this one. Growlithe also isn't that far away, so if the player cares, it won't be too hard to go back and get the Chansey. But unlike the other two trades and the Fossilmon, I don't want the game to be giving hints as to where Growlithe is. This is a player's quest to find it. Finally, we arrive at Vermilion. Please, do not use Earthquake inside of Diglett Tunnel. It will collapse and kill you. But other than that failure of municipal governance, the city always felt very big to me, serving as a trade hub for the entire region. Because of that, most of what I'm adding here is people willing to trade. First though, the dojo member, he's got speedsters in Doduo and Ponyta, but they keep getting paralyzed and become slow. Teach the player more about paralysis as a concept. Then you have the fishmonger, who can sell you unlimited Magikarp. Beautiful. The Pokemon fan club is also here, and I think that there should be a person selling Eevee for a very high price. Eevee are supposed to be pets, and in all the Pokemon games, there are never any pet stores anywhere. Except for the child casinos. You can't buy Pokemon. I am adding, though, one conventional trade. I want a Jigglypuff for a Machoke. This is probably the least impactful trade I've added. After all, the player will soon have access to Rock Tunnel, where they can catch their own Machop. But I think it adds just a bit more Poke flavor to the world. The Machop is supposed to be working construction, but it's just doing a bad job. And the Jigglypuff you're giving over will be used to help the foreman get the other Machops to fall asleep after a long day of work. I'm also reworking the Farfetch trade. Instead of them giving you ducks, they'll want a ducks. In exchange, I think a Ponyta works well. Just give the player access to another early game fire type. As part of this, Farfetch would be added to Route 6 or 5. Who cares, it's Farfetch'd. It's not a very good Pokemon. This is the last route and area before the SSN. And because it's funny, this block path will get the confinement Pokemon, Mr. Mime, Tangela, and Lickitung. There's not much else to say about this route. Diglett Tunnel should also have some other encountered ground types, just for some diversity. What's more interesting is at the end of the tunnel. You are just one cut tree away from getting to Pewter. And I think there will be the master for that dojo member back in Pewter who's stuck, unable to cut the tree down, and return to his pupil with his Kakuna and Metapod. If you cut down the tree for him, he'll offer the player a choice between Scyther and Pincer. There's also a trade in this area, but I'll remove it. The dojo gift is enough. The SS Anne is a strange location. It's got no random encounters, it's got one mandatory battle, and then it just leaves forever. I have a lot of things I would want for the SS Anne. For more Poké flavor, I think you should be able to get a Magnemite from the bowels of the ship, thinking via trade. Maybe Sandslash, but honestly anything works. But I don't want it to be a Pokemon that you can catch, it needs to be an evolution of a Pokemon that you already caught. That makes the trade a little bit more interesting, and it also sells the idea that this ship has Pokemon-based power generation. In the base game, the SS Anne serves to let the player fight more exotic Pokemon that they can catch later in the game. And on that level, it works well enough. It's just a short section of the game, and it doesn't need massive bloat, especially if it's going to leave forever. But if it isn't leaving forever, this is a pipe dream, but I would love a random trade program. The SS Anne is full of plenty of rich people, and I would think they would want to get some unique Pokemon. I think they should have like a pool of Pokemon that are more domestic or in the Safari Zone. Think Kangaskhan, Chansey, Growlithe, Eevee. Maybe after the Elite Four, they could even be trading starters. What they would want, then, would be Pokemon found in the deep wild. Pokemon like Onix, Tangela, Clefairy, Dugtrio, Pikachu. This would make it feel like the SS Anne is really bringing in new people from all over the world. Now that the player has cut, they're free. This will be when the TM shop opens in Pewter. The gym rematches for Brock and Misty are available. Rock Tunnel leading to Lavender Town can now be entered. And the gyms can be fought in any order from here, so long as Blaine is after Koga. The player is free to build their teams and kick Giovanni square in the testicles. Well, this video was all pointless. Or was it? It was. It really was. I made a poor choice making this video, and you made one watching it. What I wanted to show is how Kanto railroads the player between areas to teach all the concepts and mechanics of the game. And they do this while getting a player invested. I also sprinkled in some poor choice self-service. The Kanto region makes you take on 2 gyms with very little room to explore off the track, but then it trusts the player to give them massive freedom for the entire rest of the game. Most modern Pokemon games have really streamlined it to a massive degree, with very set gym and route orders. There's usually no optional routes until the post-game. At which point are they even optional routes? Just a general lack of interesting ways of catching Pokemon. There are few trade Pokemon and just more free gift Pokemon. The main offender here is X and Y, giving you a Gen 1 starter and a Lucario. The 3 recent open-world Pokemon games do a lot to try and expand on how a player interacts with the world. Each has its own merits and downsides. Galar gave the player massive Pokemon variety in the wild areas, but very few of the new Pokemon are actually in it. The whole thing just feels very empty. Meanwhile, its few routes and linear caves are where all the new stuff is. Their smaller scale also lets them do more interesting things. In the mines, you can see Caracol zooming down the tracks, and Stunfisk actually hide in the ground waiting for you to step on them. The smaller routes also hide the game's poor optimization and low render distance. Legends Arceus. Well, I love Legends Arceus. It really feels like I'm in the safari zone I always wanted as a kid. Catching Pokemon and picking up items is just so quick and easy. But if you want to fight and weaken the Pokemon down traditionally to catch them, that's still an option. The problem with Arceus is that there are so few battles to use all these cool Pokemon on. Nothing to do with the open world, but it also has an alternative to the trait evolutions in the linked cable, and God, I love that. Paldea. I've got to be quick. I could spend all day on its dead open world. But it does lack so many of the artificial limits that the games usually put on these worlds. Even without all the glitches that you can use to get places early, the variety of both old and new Pokemon you can catch immediately is huge. The area function of the Pokédex isn't very useful, so it can be hard to find the Pokemon, but you still have so much freedom to find and catch them all. Of course, though, the game clearly doesn't want you to, since most will disobey you until you get a Pokemon League certified gym badge. I can't stay on Scarlet and Violet. I actually really like the games, but they make me mad. I think what I want to leave you with is that even open world games, or games that focus on exploration, can have railroaded beginnings. Walls in a player's way doesn't mean that a game doesn't want you to explore. Game design doesn't need unlimited, 100% freedom all the time. Look at the Grand Plateau in Breath of the Wild. And even after you get off that plateau, it creates obstacles that require hard work to get past. You can't enter Gerudo Town until you get the Gerudo clothes. There's the massive heat of Death Mountain that will burn you alive unless you make fireproof elixirs. And of course, the massive difficulty of Hyrule Castle and fighting your way to Ganon. Kanto is built on a railroad that lets you get into a car once you understand how to drive. It spends its time teaching you the basics while drip feeding in optional content for the player so that they feel like they still have agency and purpose within the game. Game Freak has an amazing primary loop in battling, and they have made it shine beautifully in future games. The tertiary loop, though, that's fallen a bit of a ways. Scarlet and Violet put all the Pokemon really worth going out of your way for inside the same crater that they don't let you enter until the very end. Also, Gimmighoul. I love Gimmighoul. But Game Freak really did let the secondary loop stagnate hard. They just have dull, empty routes to travel that lead to boring towns that house the gym leaders. There's nothing in all of those cities. To prevent an hour-long rant on Scarlet and Violet, I'm going to end this here. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching. If you want me to cover a section of another game, let me know. Doesn't have to be Pokemon, but I do love me some Pokemon.